The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Jack Morrison's weathered face as he rode his horse along the far edge of his ranch. It was August 1952, and the heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. His cattle had been acting strange lately, bunching up near the eastern fence line instead of spreading out across the pasture like they usually did. Something was drawing them to that area, and Jack needed to find out what. As a rancher for over 20 years, Jack had learned to read the signs. When cattle changed their patterns, it usually meant trouble. Maybe rustlers were scouting his land, or perhaps a mountain lion had moved into the territory. Either way, he couldn't afford to lose any more livestock. The drought had already hit his herd hard, and every head of cattle counted. His horse, a reliable bay mare named Dusty, picked her way carefully through the rocky terrain. The landscape here was different from the rest of his property. Ancient cottonwood trees provided patches of shade, and a small creek wound its way between smooth stones. It was prettier than most of his ranch, but also harder to patrol. The thick brush and scattered boulders created perfect hiding spots for anyone who didn't belong. Jack had bought this land fair and square from the government 5 years ago. He had the papers in his safe at home, all signed and official. The previous owner had been some distant relative of early settlers who never even lived on the property. As far as Jack was concerned, he had every right to be here, and everyone else needed to stay out. But as he rounded a bend in the creek, Jack pulled his horse to a sudden stop. There, sitting cross-legged on a flat rock beside the water, was an old man. Not just any old man, but clearly an Apache elder. His long gray hair was braided with what looked like eagle feathers, and his dark skin was deeply lined with age. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, and worn pants, but something about the way he sat suggested this wasn't just any trespasser. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward the revolver on his hip. Cattle rustlers had been hitting ranches all across the county, and everyone knew they sometimes used scouts to check out properties before making their move. But this old man didn't look like a scout. He looked like he belonged here, which made Jack even more suspicious. The elderly Apache appeared to be arranging stones in some kind of pattern around himself. Small, smooth river rocks were placed in a careful circle, with larger stones marking what seemed like important points. Jack had heard about Indian rituals and ceremonies, though he'd never seen one up close. The whole scene made him uncomfortable. In a way he couldn't quite explain. Jack dismounted slowly, keeping his eyes on the old man. Dusty snorted and shook her head as if she could sense the tension building. The creek bubbled peacefully between them, creating the only sound in the desert silence. Birds had stopped singing. Even the usual buzz of insects seemed muted. "Hey there, old-timer," Jack called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're on private property. This is my land, and you need to move along." The Apache elder looked up slowly, and Jack felt a strange chill despite the blazing heat. The old man's eyes were dark and deep, holding something that made Jack think of ancient secrets and old pain. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly across the small distance between them. "This place ... The old man said in heavily accented English. "It knows me. I know this place." Jack frowned. That wasn't the response he'd expected. Most trespassers either argued about property lines or apologized and left quickly. This old man seemed completely unconcerned about Jack's claim to the land. "Look, I don't care if you think you know this place," Jack said, stepping closer but keeping his distance. "I've got legal papers that say this is my ranch. You're trespassing, and I'm asking you nicely to leave." The elder continued arranging his stones as if Jack hadn't spoken at all. He picked up each rock carefully, examining it before placing it in exactly the right spot. His movements were deliberate and respectful, like he was handling something precious. "My father," the old man said without looking up. "He is here, his father too. They sleep in this ground." Jack felt his patience running thin. The old man was obviously confused, maybe suffering from the heat or just too old to understand the situation. But Jack had work to do and couldn't waste time dealing with a confused trespasser. "Your father isn't here," Jack said firmly. "This is cattle country, has been for years. Now I'm telling you one more time to pack up your rocks and move on." For the first time, the Apache elder looked directly at Jack. Those ancient eyes seemed to see right through him, and Jack had to fight the urge to step backward. When the old man spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "I am Joseph Crow Feather," he said slowly, pronouncing each word carefully. "My people, we lived here when your grandfather was still in the place across. The big water, this creek, it gave us life. These trees, they gave us shade and wood for our fires." Jack shook his head. "I don't care who you are or what stories you've heard. This land belongs to me now. I paid good money for it, and I've got the deed to prove it." But even as he said the words, something nagged at him. The way the old man sat so naturally beside the creek, the careful placement of the stones, the confidence in his voice when he spoke about this place. It was almost like he really did belong here, like Jack was the intruder instead of the other way around. Joseph reached into a small leather pouch that hung from his belt. Jack's hand tightened on his gun, ready to draw if needed. But instead of a weapon, the old man pulled out what looked like a piece of turquoise, smooth and blue-green in the sunlight. He held it up like it meant something important. "This stone?" Joseph said, "My grandmother, she found it right there." He pointed to a spot near the creek where the water had carved a small pool between the rocks. "She gave it to my father when he became a man. He gave it to me before the soldiers came and took us away." Jack stared at the turquoise, then at the spot Joseph had indicated. There was nothing special about it that he could see, just another part of the creek bed. But the old man spoke about it like he was describing a sacred place. "The soldiers came?" Jack asked, despite himself. Joseph nodded slowly. "Many times. First they said we could stay if we farmed like white men. Then they said we had to go to the reservation. Then they said we could come back. Then they said no, we could not. Always changing, always promises that broke like dry sticks." The old man's voice held no anger, just a deep sadness that seemed to settle over the peaceful creek like a shadow. Jack found himself listening despite his irritation, drawn in by something he couldn't name. "My sister," Joseph continued, "she was just learning to walk when the sickness came. The winter after the soldiers moved us the first time. She died before the snow melted." He gestured toward a small rise near the largest cottonwood tree. "We brought her back here to sleep with our ancestors." She was too little to understand about reservations and papers and who owns what ground. Jack followed the old man's gesture and studied the area he'd indicated. Now that he looked closely, there did seem to be something different about that spot. The grass grew a little differently, and there were stones arranged in what might have been a pattern, though weather and time had scattered them. "That's just an old camping spot," Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction, probably left by some previous owner. Joseph smiled sadly and shook his head. "You see rocks and old grass? I see my sister's resting place and my father's bones in the place, where my people sang and danced and told stories for more winters than you can count." The two men stared at each other across the small creek, neither willing to give ground. Jack felt his certainty beginning to crack, like a dam with water seeping through tiny fissures. But he couldn't just let some old man claim his property based on old stories and scattered stones. The sun continued to beat down, and somewhere in the distance, Jack's cattle lowed softly as they grazed. Time seemed to slow down beside the ancient creek, where an old Apache elder sat with his sacred stones and a stubborn rancher struggled with questions he didn't want to face. Jack's jaw tightened as he watched the old Apache man continue his strange ritual with the stones. The peaceful creek bubbled between them, but tension hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Jack had been patient enough, and his cattle weren't going to check themselves. "Listen here, old man," Jack said, raising his voice. "I don't care about your stories or your rocks or whatever you think happened here 100 years ago. I've got legal papers that say this land is mine. That means you're trespassing, plain and simple." Joseph Crowfeather didn't even look up. He continued placing stones in his careful pattern, each one positioned with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice. His weathered hands moved slowly but surely, treating each rock like it mattered more than anything else in the world. "Papers," Joseph said quietly, still focused on his work. White man always has papers. The dismissive tone in the old man's voice made Jack's blood boil. He'd worked hard for everything he owned, saved every penny to buy this ranch, and dealt with years of drought and cattle thieves to make it profitable. He wasn't about to let some confused old Indian make him feel guilty about his own property. "That's right, I have papers," Jack snapped. "Legal documents signed by government officials. I paid $15,000 for this land, which is more than most people see in a lifetime. So, yes, I have papers, and they give me the right to tell you to get off my property." Joseph finally looked up, and Jack saw something flash in those dark eyes. Not anger exactly, but something deeper and more complicated. The old man reached into his leather pouch again, moving slowly and deliberately. Jack's hand hovered near his gun, ready to draw if necessary, but instead of a weapon, Joseph pulled out a faded photograph. The edges were worn soft from handling, and the image was yellowed with age. He held it carefully, like it might crumble in his fingers, then extended it toward Jack. "You want to see papers?" Joseph asked. "Here is my paper." Jack hesitated. Every instinct told him not to get closer to the old man, not to engage with whatever game he was playing, but curiosity got the better of him. He took a step forward, close enough to see the photograph clearly, though he kept his distance. The picture showed a group of Apache families standing beside the very creek where they now faced each other. Jack could recognize the distinctive bend in the water and the large cottonwood tree in the background. In the photo, children played at the water's edge while adults stood watching. Women in traditional dress held babies, while men with long braids and serious expressions looked directly at the camera. "This picture," Joseph said, pointing to specific figures, "my father there, my grandmother there, my uncle and my cousins. This was before the first soldiers came, before the first promises that were broken." Jack studied the photograph more closely. The people in it looked happy and settled, like they belonged exactly where they were standing. Behind them, he could see what looked like permanent structures, not just temporary camping spots. "That could be anywhere," Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. The landmarks in the photo matched perfectly with their surroundings. Joseph pointed to the oddly shaped boulder that sat about 50 yards upstream. In the photograph, the same rock was clearly visible, though smaller trees surrounded it then. The old man then gestured toward the bent cottonwood that provided shade near the creek bank. There it was in the picture too, younger and straighter, but unmistakably the same tree. "This ground knows my people," Joseph said. "Every stone, every tree, every place where water runs. We did not just live here. We were part of this place, and it was part of us." Jack felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. He'd always thought of his ranch as empty land that he'd improved and made productive. The idea that families had lived here, raised children here, made memories here, didn't fit with his understanding of how he'd come to own the property. "Well, that was then, and this is now," Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Things change. People move on. That's just how the world works." Joseph carefully tucked the photograph back into his pouch, treating it like the precious thing it obviously was. Then he began to speak in his native language, words that flowed like the creek water, melodic and rhythmic. Jack didn't understand a single word, but the sound made him nervous. "What are you saying?" Jack demanded. "Are you cursing me or something?" The old man paused and looked at Jack with what might have been amusement. "I am thanking the spirits of this place for letting me return. I am asking my ancestors to help you understand what you cannot see with your eyes. I can see just fine," Jack said. "I see an old man who's lost and needs to find his way back to wherever he came from." Joseph shook his head sadly. "You see only what is here now. You do not see what was here before or what should be here tomorrow. That is why you are afraid of an old man sitting by water that has run in this place since before your people knew this land existed." "I'm not afraid of you," Jack protested, though he realized his hand was still resting on his gun. "I'm just trying to run a business here. I've got cattle to check and work to do." "Yes," Joseph said quietly, "you have work. Building fences to keep people out. Bringing animals that eat the grass down to dirt. Taking water from the creek to fill tanks. You work very hard to make this place into something it was never meant to be. Jack felt his temper flare again. That's called ranching, old man. That's called making a living. That's called progress. Joseph reached into his pouch one more time and pulled out another object. This one made Jack take an involuntary step backward. It was a small arrowhead, perfectly knapped from dark stone, with a leather cord through a carefully drilled hole. "My great-grandfather made this," Joseph said, holding it up to catch the sunlight. "He used it to hunt deer in the forest that once grew where your cattle graze now. His father's father used this very ground to teach young men how to read the signs of animals, how to find water in dry times, how to live with the land instead of fighting against it." Jack stared at the arrowhead, trying to imagine forests where now only scattered trees remained. The idea seemed impossible, but something in Joseph's voice convinced him the old man wasn't lying. "That's ancient history," Jack said weakly. "You can't expect me to give up my ranch because of old stories." Joseph carefully returned the arrowhead to his pouch and resumed his stone arrangement. "I do not ask you to give up anything. I ask only that you remember this place has a longer story than the one written on your papers." The two men fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Jack found himself really looking at the landscape for the first time since he'd owned it. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before, the way certain stones seemed deliberately placed, the paths worn into the ground that his cattle used but hadn't created, the way the creek bent in a pattern that seemed almost intentional. "Even if all that's true," Jack said finally, "even if your people did live here once, that doesn't change the fact that I own it now. I paid for it fair and square." Joseph nodded slowly. "Yes, you paid, but who did you pay? Who had the right to sell what belonged to my people for 1,000 generations?" The question hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He'd never thought about where the government had gotten the right to sell him the land. He just assumed that because it was for sale, it was theirs to sell. "The government," Jack said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "The same government that promised my people we could stay if we learned to farm like white men. The same government that moved us to reservations when they decided they wanted our land for other white men. The same government that sold you the bones of my ancestors and called it progress." Joseph's voice remained calm, but Jack could hear the pain underneath the words. For the first time, he began to understand that this wasn't just about property lines or legal documents. This was about something much deeper and more complicated. The sun was climbing higher, and the heat was becoming almost unbearable. Jack's horse stamped her feet impatiently, ready to move on. But neither man seemed willing to back down from their position by the ancient creek, where past and present collided like storm fronts on the horizon. The desert heat was becoming unbearable, but neither man moved from their positions beside the creek. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, while Joseph seemed completely unaffected by the blazing sun. The old Apache sat as still as the stones around him, like he'd learned long ago how to find coolness even in the hottest weather. Minutes passed in silence. Jack kept glancing at his watch, thinking about all the work waiting for him back at the ranch house, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the growing feeling that this conversation was more important than checking fence lines. Joseph finally spoke, his voice barely louder than the bubbling creek. "You want to know why I sit here with these stones?" Jack found himself nodding, though he wasn't sure why. Part of him wanted to mount his horse and ride away, leaving the old man to his mysterious ritual. But a bigger part needed to understand what was happening here. "When I was 7 years old," Joseph began, "my father brought me to this exact spot. He taught me how to listen to the water, how to read the tracks of animals in the mud, how to find the plants that could heal sickness or ease pain." The old man's eyes grew distant, as if he was seeing through the years to that long-ago day. "My father, he was a wise man. He knew the soldiers would come again, knew our time in this place was ending. So he made sure I would remember everything." Jack shifted uncomfortably. Stories about the past always made him uneasy, especially when they involved government soldiers and displaced people. It was easier to think about land ownership in simple terms. Legal documents and property lines, not complicated histories and broken promises. He showed me where the deer came to drink at dawn, Joseph continued, pointing toward a shaded area. Upstream, where the eagles built their nests in the tall rocks, where the healing roots grew deepest in the earth. He said someday I might need to find this place again, even if it looked different. Despite his irritation, Jack found himself following Joseph's gestures, trying to see the landscape through the old man's eyes. The shaded area upstream did look like the kind of place animals would feel safe drinking. And now that he thought about it, he had seen eagles circling the rocky outcroppings to the north. My father also told me about the white men who were starting to come into our territory, Joseph said. He did not hate them, even though many of our people did. He said they were like a great flood that could not be stopped, only survived. Jack felt a strange mix of guilt and defensiveness. Your father sounds like a smart man, but that doesn't change the fact that times were different then. The world had to change. People had to adapt. Joseph nodded slowly. Yes, we adapted. When the first soldiers came, we tried farming like they wanted us to. We planted corn and beans where we used to hunt. We built square houses instead of living in the old way. We cut our hair and sent our children to their schools. The old man reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, worn piece of metal. Jack leaned closer and realized it was a military medal, tarnished with age but still clearly recognizable. I adapted too, Joseph said, holding up the medal. When the Great War came, I left the reservation and joined the army. I learned to speak the white man's language perfectly. I learned to use their weapons, to follow their orders, to fight their enemies. Jack stared at the medal in surprise. You fought in the war? 2 wars, Joseph corrected. The first one, I was just a young man who wanted to prove that Indians could be good Americans. The second one, I was older, had a family, but they needed men who could speak in codes the enemy could not break. Jack had heard about the Indian code talkers, though he'd never met one before. The idea that this old man sitting by his creek had served his country in battle changed something in Jack's understanding of the situation. I was in the Pacific, Joseph continued. Islands where men died for pieces of land smaller than your ranch. I saw American boys, white boys, black boys, boys who spoke different languages but all bled the same red blood for the same flag. The old man's voice carried a weight that came from witnessing terrible things. Jack had been too young for the first war and too old for the second, but he'd heard enough stories to know what combat could do to a man. When I came home, Joseph said, I expected things to be different. I had fought for America, proved my loyalty, earned my place. But the reservation was still the reservation. The promises were still just words on paper that meant nothing when white men wanted something we had. Jack didn't know what to say. The simple story of trespassing and property rights was becoming something much more complicated. Joseph wasn't just some confused old man wandering where he didn't belong. He was a veteran, a man who had served his country and earned the right to be treated with respect. That medal, Jack said awkwardly. What's it for? Joseph looked down at the piece of metal in his palm. Bravery, they said. For crawling through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. For staying at my radio when the Japanese were bombing our position. For doing my duty even when I was scared. The old man carefully returned the medal to his pouch. But the real bravery came later, when I had to watch my own children grow up thinking they were not good enough, not American enough, not white enough to matter. Jack felt something twisting in his stomach. He'd never thought about what it might be like to serve your country and still be treated like a second-class citizen. His own grandfather had fought in the Civil War and come home to a hero's welcome. The contrast made him uncomfortable. My son Thomas, Joseph continued, he also joined the Marines. Korea. He came back harder than when he left, angry about things I hoped he would never have to learn. He does not have patience for old men and their gentle ways. There was something in Joseph's voice that made Jack look up sharply. Your son? He will be here soon, Joseph said calmly. I told him I was coming to visit this place, to say goodbye. To my ancestors before I become too old to make the journey. He worries about me traveling alone. Jack felt a chill despite the blazing heat. He's coming here? Joseph nodded, still arranging his stones with methodical care. Thomas leads our tribal council now. He fights for our rights in the courts, argues with government lawyers, protects our people from those who would take what little we have left. The way Joseph talked about his son made it clear that Thomas was not someone who would approach this situation with an old man's patience and diplomacy. Jack began to understand that his simple confrontation with a trespasser was about to become something much more serious. "How many people is he bringing?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Joseph shrugged. "However many he thinks he needs to make sure his old father is safe." Jack's mind raced. He was one man with one gun, miles from his ranch house and any possible help. If Joseph's son was bringing a group of tribal members, and if they were as angry as the old man suggested, Jack could be in real trouble. "Look," Jack said, "maybe we can work something out here. I'm not trying to cause problems for you or your family." For the first time since they'd been talking, Joseph smiled. It was a sad smile, but genuine. "You are beginning to understand, I think. This is not about you or me. This is about the land itself, and all the people who have loved it and lost it and found it again." The old man gestured toward the creek, the trees, the rocks where he'd placed his careful arrangement of stones. "My people believe that land cannot be owned, only borrowed. We are all just visitors here, some for longer than others. Your papers say you own this place, but the earth itself knows better." Jack looked around the landscape with new eyes, seeing not just property lines and grazing land, but layers of history and meaning he'd never considered before. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of horses approaching. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, like thunder rolling across the desert floor. Jack's heart started beating faster as he realized this wasn't just one or two riders. The rhythmic pounding of hooves told him a large group was heading their way, and they were moving fast. Joseph continued arranging his stones, completely calm despite the approaching riders. His weathered hands moved with the same careful precision they'd shown for the past 30 minutes, as if nothing in the world could disturb his ritual. But Jack noticed the old man's eyes had changed. There was a spark of something there now. Maybe pride, maybe relief, maybe something else entirely. "That's your son?" Jack asked, his voice tighter than he wanted it to be. "Thomas," Joseph confirmed without looking up from his stones. "He promised to find me before the sun reached the center of the sky." Jack glanced at his watch and realized exactly 30 minutes had passed since his confrontation with Joseph had begun. The timing seemed too perfect to be accidental. Had the old man been stalling, waiting for reinforcements to arrive? Or had his son simply known exactly where to find him? The dust cloud on the horizon was getting bigger, and Jack could make out individual riders now. He counted them quickly, 12, maybe 13 men on horseback, all moving with the kind of purpose that made his mouth go dry. These weren't casual visitors or curious neighbors. These were men on a mission. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his revolver, then stopped. 13 against 1 weren't odds that could be improved by drawing a weapon. If these men had come looking for trouble, shooting would only make things worse. But if he appeared weak or scared, that might encourage them to push harder than they otherwise would. "What did you tell them?" Jack asked Joseph. "What do they think is happening here?" Joseph finally looked up from his stones, and Jack saw something. That might have been sympathy in those ancient eyes. "I told them I was coming to say goodbye to my ancestors. I told them I was old and might need help getting home. That's all." Joseph shrugged. "Thomas worries about many things. He sees danger where I see only conversation." The riders were close. Enough now that Jack could make out their faces. The man in the lead was clearly Joseph's son. He had the same strong features and dignified bearing. But where Joseph radiated calm patience, Thomas projected barely controlled intensity. He was younger than Jack had expected, probably in his mid-40s, with short hair and clothes that suggested he was equally comfortable in boardrooms and on horseback. The other riders spread out as they approached, forming a loose semicircle. They've effectively surrounded Jack and Joseph without making it look like a deliberate tactical maneuver. Jack recognized the movement. These men had military training, or at least enough experience in dangerous situations to know how to position themselves for maximum advantage. Thomas dismounted while his horse was still moving, hitting the ground with the fluid grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in Jack's position, his father's calm demeanor, and the careful arrangement of stones that marked this as a sacred gathering rather than a casual meeting. "Father," Thomas said in English, though Jack could hear the slight accent that marked him as someone who'd learned the language as a second tongue. "Are you well?" "I am well, my son," Joseph replied, still seated among his stones. "This man and I have been having an interesting conversation about the nature of ownership." Thomas's gaze shifted to Jack, and Jack felt like he was being measured by someone who didn't miss much. Thomas was taller than his father, broader in the shoulders, with the kind of steady confidence that came from leading men in difficult situations. But there was also something hard in his eyes, a wariness that suggested he'd learned not to trust easily. "I'm Jack Morrison," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is my ranch. I was just asking your father to move along so I could check on my cattle." Thomas nodded slowly, but Jack could see he wasn't buying the simple explanation. "Your ranch," Thomas repeated. "How long have you owned this particular piece of ground?" "5 years," Jack replied. "Bought it fair and square from the government." "Land office." "Fair and square," Thomas said, and there was something in his tone that made the phrase sound like an accusation. "The same government that promised my people we could keep this land if we learned to farm. The same government that moved us to a reservation when white settlers decided they wanted our farms. The same government that's been breaking promises to Indians for longer than you've been alive." Jack felt the hostility rolling off Thomas like heat from a forge. This wasn't going to be the gentle, philosophical conversation he'd been having with Joseph. Thomas had come here ready for a fight, and Jack's claim of legal ownership had just given him a reason to start one. "Look," Jack said, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't reaching for his weapon. "I understand you're upset, but I didn't have anything to do with what happened to your people in the past. I'm just trying to run a cattle ranch and make an honest living." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "An honest living on stolen ground, using water that flowed here, when my great-grandfather was teaching my grandfather to hunt. You think your paper makes this right?" The other riders were still mounted, but Jack could see they were ready to dismount quickly if their leader gave the word. They weren't making threatening gestures, but they didn't need to. Their presence was threat enough. "The land was legally purchased," Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I paid $15,000 for this property. That's more money than most people see in their entire lives." Thomas stepped closer, and Jack could see the anger burning behind his controlled exterior. $15,000? Thomas repeated. "What's the price of a people's homeland? What's the fair market value of our ancestors' bones? Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what did the government charge you for the privilege of grazing cattle over my sister's grave?" Jack felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Joseph had mentioned a sister who died as a child buried somewhere on this land. The idea that his cattle might be walking over human remains made him feel sick. "I didn't know," Jack said quietly. "Nobody told me about any graves." "Of course they didn't," Thomas said. "Why would they? Dead Indians don't affect property values." Joseph spoke from his position among the stones, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Thomas, this man listened to my stories. He looked at our old photograph. He has shown respect." Thomas glanced at his father, and Jack saw something complicated pass between them. Love and protectiveness, but also disagreement about how to handle the situation. "Respect," Thomas said. "That's good, Father. But respect doesn't give us back our homeland. Respect doesn't bring back the children who died because we were forced to leave this place. Respect doesn't undo 60 years of broken promises." Jack found himself caught between the two men, Joseph's gentle insistence that understanding was possible, and Thomas's righteous anger at decades of injustice. Both perspectives made sense, but they seemed to lead to completely different conclusions about what should happen next. "What do you want?" Jack asked Thomas directly. "What would make this right?" Thomas studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the question was genuine or just another attempt to avoid trouble. When he spoke, his voice was quieter but no less intense. "I want my children to grow up knowing where they come from. I want them to be able to visit their ancestors' resting places without asking permission from strangers. I want the water that gave life to my people for 1,000 generations to run clean instead of being fouled by cattle waste. I want justice, Mr. Morrison, but I'll settle for acknowledgement that this land has a history that didn't begin with your deed." The two men stared at each other across the space that separated them, while Joseph continued his patient work with the stones and the other riders waited to see what their leader would decide. The desert sun beat down on all of them equally, and the ancient creek continued its eternal journey toward the distant mountains, carrying with it the memories of all who had ever knelt beside its banks to drink. The tension by the creek had reached its breaking point. 13 Apache riders faced one cowboy, while an elderly man sat peacefully among his sacred stones as if the whole world wasn't balanced on a knife's edge. Jack could feel sweat running down his back that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight. Ready for whatever was about to happen, Thomas took another step forward, his jaw set and his eyes burning with decades of accumulated anger. Jack had seen that look before in the faces of men who'd been pushed too far and were ready to push back. It was the look of someone who'd run out of patience for talking and was ready to take action. "You want to know what I think, Mr. Morrison?" Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "I think you're just another white man who took what didn't belong to him and convinced himself it was legal, because somebody gave him a piece of paper." Jack's hand started to move toward his gun more from instinct than any real plan. Against 13 men, drawing a weapon would be suicide, but sometimes a cornered animal doesn't think clearly about odds. That's when Joseph's voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Thomas." Just one word spoken quietly, but it carried the kind of authority that only comes from a father who's earned his son's deep respect. Thomas stopped moving immediately, his head turning toward the old man who still sat calmly among his stones. Joseph looked up at his son, and Jack saw something pass between them that was deeper than words. It was the kind of communication that happens between people who've shared a lifetime of struggles and understand each other completely. "This man," Joseph said, gesturing toward Jack without taking his eyes off Thomas, "he listened to my stories. He looked at our family photograph. He asked questions instead of just ordering me to leave." Thomas frowned. "So, plenty of white men are polite when they think it might save them trouble." Joseph shook his head slowly. "No, my son, this one is different. When I told him about your sister's resting place, he became troubled. When I showed him my war medal, he looked at it with respect. When I spoke of broken promises, he heard the pain in my words." Jack felt his face flush. He hadn't realized the old man had been watching him so carefully during their conversation. Everything Joseph said was true. The stories had affected him. The photograph had made him question his assumptions, and the medal had forced him to see Joseph as more than just a trespasser. "He still claims to own our homeland," Thomas pointed out, though some of the fire had gone out of his voice. Joseph smiled sadly. "Yes, he has his papers. But papers are just symbols, Thomas. What matters is what lives in a man's heart." The old Apache struggled to his feet, moving slowly but refusing Thomas's offered hand. He brushed dust from his clothes and looked around the landscape that had shaped his entire life. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 8 decades of wisdom. "I am old," Joseph said simply. "My bones ache when storms are coming, and my eyes don't see as clearly as they once did. I know I will not live to see many more summers." Thomas started to protest, but Joseph held up a weathered hand to stop him. "This is truth, my son. And because it is truth, I must think carefully about how I want to spend the time I have left. Do I want to spend it fighting over ground that will outlast all of us? Do I want to teach my grandchildren that anger is the only response to injustice? Or do I want to show them that sometimes wisdom means finding a different path? Jack found himself holding his breath, sensing that Joseph was about to say something that would change everything. The other riders seemed to feel it too, because they'd all gone perfectly still, waiting to hear what their elder would decide. Joseph turned to face Jack directly. You have legal ownership of this land. I do not dispute your papers or challenge your right to run cattle here. But I ask you to remember that ownership comes with responsibility. Jack nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. My ancestors sleep in this ground, Joseph continued. My sister's bones rest beneath the big cottonwood tree. My father's father used these stones to build the first shelter in this place. Can you allow an old man to visit them sometimes, to speak with their spirits and honor their memory? The request was so simple, so reasonable, that Jack felt ashamed he hadn't thought of it himself. Here was a solution that honored both men's positions without requiring either to surrender their fundamental beliefs. Yes, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't fully understand. Yes, of course you can visit any time you want. Thomas looked skeptical. And when you decide we're inconvenient? When you change your mind or sell the ranch to someone who doesn't want Indians around? Jack met Thomas's challenging stare directly. Then I'll put it in writing. Legal documents filed with the county. Your family will have the right to access this area permanently, no matter who owns the ranch. Joseph smiled, and for the first time since this confrontation began, it was a smile of genuine warmth. You see, Thomas? Sometimes the best solution is one that honors everyone's truth. Thomas still looked unconvinced, but Jack could see him, wrestling with his father's wisdom and his own justifiable anger. This was a man who'd spent his adult life fighting legal battles and dealing with broken promises. Trust didn't come easily. There's something else, Jack said, surprising himself. With his own words. If there are graves here, they should be marked properly. Protected. I've got cattle wandering all over this land, and that's not right if people are buried here. Joseph's eyes widened in surprise. This was more than he dared to hope for. You would do this? The old man asked. Jack nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure where the words had come from. It's the right thing to do. I may own the paper on this land, but I'm not the only one with a connection to it. If your family lived here for generations, if children are buried here, then I need to respect that. Thomas dismounted and walked over to stand beside his father. Up close, Jack could see that while Thomas had his father's strong features, he also carried the weight of trying to protect his people in a world that often saw them as obstacles to progress. Why? Thomas asked quietly. Why would you do this? For people you don't even know? Jack thought about the question seriously before answering. Because 30 minutes ago, I thought this was just empty land that I'd improved and made productive. Your father showed me it was never empty. It was full of families and stories and memories that I never bothered to learn about. That makes me responsible for more than just the cattle and the fences. Joseph reached into his leather pouch final time and pulled out a small piece of turquoise, the same one he'd shown Jack earlier. He held it out to the cowboy. This stone came from this creek, Joseph said. My grandmother found it here when she was a young woman. It has been in my family for 3 generations. I want you to have it. Jack stared at the offered stone, understanding that this was far more than a simple gift. This was Joseph's way of saying that the cowboy had proven himself worthy of trust, that he could be counted on to keep his promises. I can't take something that valuable, Jack protested. Joseph pressed the turquoise into Jack's palm and closed the cowboy's fingers around it. It belongs to this place. You are the guardian of this place now. It should stay with you. Thomas extended his hand to Jack, and after a moment's hesitation, Jack shook it. The Apache's grip was firm and steady, the handshake of a man who'd decided to take a chance on trust instead of defaulting to conflict. My father believes in you, Thomas said. That's good enough for me, but if you break your word to him, you'll answer to me. Jack nodded, understanding completely. Fair enough. As the Apache riders prepared to leave, Joseph gathered his stones. Carefully, placing each one back in his leather pouch with the same reverence he'd shown when arranging them. The ritual was ending, but Jack sensed that something new was beginning. "I'll come back next month," Joseph told Jack. "To visit my family and to see how you're caring for this place?" "I'll be here," Jack promised Dot as the riders disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert. Jack stood alone by the creek, turning the piece of turquoise over in his palm. The land looked the same as it had an hour ago, but everything had changed. He was no longer just a rancher protecting his property from trespassers. He was a guardian of something much more precious and complicated than he'd ever imagined. The creek bubbled peacefully beside him, carrying its ancient message toward the distant mountains. And for the first time since he'd owned this land, Jack felt like he truly belonged here.